Okay, so we begin this hour with breaking news out of China about 2 Canadian men detained without official charges since December. Beijing confirms this morning that Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor have now been formally arrested, and they're arrested on charges related to espionage. Our Asia correspondent Sasha Petrosic joins us now from the Chinese capital with the details. So Sasha, let's talk about Kovrig and Spavor. What has changed for these 2 men?
Well, Natasha, it's been more than 5 difficult months for the 2 of them in detention, and things got more serious today. They were charged with very, very serious charges here in Beijing. That announcement was made. For Kovrig, who is a former Canadian diplomat, he's being charged with gathering state secrets and intelligence for overseas forces, presumably for Canada. Spavor, who is a businessman who has been living here in China, he's been charged with providing state secrets to foreign forces. Again, presumably Canada. And there's been some speculation that the 2 are linked, that he was perhaps being charged because he was providing those state secrets to Michael Kovrig. This is, of course, one big conspiracy. China has not provided any actual proof or details. There was one statement a couple of months ago by a prosecutor saying that their case was very, very good, but they did wait until almost the very limit before charging them, and now things will presumably get a little more formal because this now goes through the court system here in China, but it doesn't mean that we will know any more about what's going on. Under normal circumstances, this is a very, very secretive process, one that doesn't really reveal anything about what's going on until something has already happened. I don't expect things to be any different here. In fact, things will probably be more serious because these are espionage charges. As for the 2 men, they will probably be transferred now from these informal detention centers where they've been held reportedly with their lights on 24 hours a day, interrogated every single day without access to their families or to lawyers, just to diplomats once a month. And they will be transferred now presumably to the actual jail system here in China, but that might not be much better.
Sasha, all the way through this story, this hasn't just been about 2 men with possible charges coming up against them. This is the story of 2 countries in a matter of a dispute. So we're talking about diplomacy, trade, all these tensions between Canada and China. Does this, in fact, heighten the tensions?
Well, I think every single step heightens those tensions, and this has now become a much more formal process, one that will be probably more difficult for either China or Canada to unravel. As you say, this is combined with a whole bunch of other issues, sparked, it seems, by the arrest of Meng Wanzhou. She's the Huawei executive who was picked up in Vancouver on charges from Washington. She is out on bail in Vancouver, living at one of her residences, waiting for extradition hearings to continue. Obviously very different conditions than Kovrig and Spavor are living in here in China. But, you know, that triggered things, and since then, everything has really snowballed here. We have heard about all of the different trade problems that Canada has been having with canola, with other agricultural products. Every time a Canadian business intersects with official China now, there have been delays and other issues. The Canadian-China Business Council has reported that many of its members have seen this kind of thing. Now, there's a general feeling here that things are very difficult between Canada and China on every official level. That's not about to change. In fact, if anything, things are going to get worse. Today, China said that Canada should not interfere in its judicial process now. Canada has said that all of this is very arbitrary and that these charges are really just trumped up in retaliation for what Canada's doing at the request of the United States.
Okay, Sasha Petrosic is our Asia correspondent in Beijing. Thank you, Sasha. And we will have
My pleasure.
And we will have more coverage on this breaking news later in the hour. I'm going to speak to a professor of Canada-China relations and a former diplomat to China about what the arrests mean for Spavor and Kovrig. That interview is coming up in about 20 minutes. That's at 6:30 a.m. Eastern. The Trump administration is also potentially cranking up tensions with China this morning, and the U.S. president is doing that by targeting Huawei. Beijing and Washington are already locked in a worsening trade dispute that is disrupting their economies and shaking up world markets. Now Trump is effectively banning Huawei equipment from the U.S. telecom networks. Scott is here with that story. So Scott, let's start with China's response this morning.
Yeah, clearly they're not happy, and the Commerce Ministry is saying that they strongly oppose this measure. Under national security, the Trump administration is saying that Huawei is effectively banned from doing business, you could say. So they said they strongly oppose other countries imposing unilateral sanctions against Chinese companies, and that the U.S. should avoid further impacting Sino-U.S. trade relations. And this is, of course, in response to the Trump administration through the U.S. Commerce Department adding Huawei and 70 affiliated companies to its so-called entity list that's under the guise of national security. So this move effectively bans Huawei from acquiring components and technology from U.S. firms without U.S. government approval. And in addition to that, on the other side of the equation, he's also signed an executive order, that's Donald Trump, banning U.S. firms from using telecom equipment made by companies deemed a national securities risk. So this is all under the Emergency Economic Powers Act enacted late last night, gives the president the authority to regulate companies in response to perceived national emergency threats against foreign adversaries. And there's been long accusations by the U.S. administration against Huawei, saying that they have so-called spy software built into their chips. There's a backdoor method for the Chinese to be able to spy. And Huawei, for their part, they're the largest telecommunications equipment manufacturer in the world, the second biggest cell phone maker. So this is a big impact if this comes to pass, Natasha.
And once again, Canada gets pulled into this dispute, Scott, because we know that Canada is now under pressure from the United States on the issue of Huawei. What are we hearing from Ottawa? Yeah,
Ottawa wants to build a 5G network along the 401 network anywhere between Toronto and Montreal. This 5G network is essential for automated vehicles, and so Huawei would be a potential participant in that, if not a leader in 5G technology. So Ralph Goodale, the Public Safety Minister, sort of walking the line in what this is going to mean for Canada. Here he is.
It is a very complex field, and that is why this examination is taking the time that it needs to take to make sure that we get this right. It's extremely important that Canadians have the benefits of 5G. It is a huge enabling new technology that has enormous potential, but it also carries with it, depending on the supply chain, some significant risks.
And a lot of significant risks, as you mentioned, Natasha, as well. That is increasing the friction between Canada and China on those very issues.
Okay, thank you, Scott. Welcome back. More now on our top story. China's decision to formally charge two Canadians, Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig. Beijing's move comes more than 5 months after the arrest of Huawei's chief financial officer in Vancouver on a U.S. warrant. Charles Burton is a senior fellow at the Mcdonald-Laurier Institute. He's also a professor of Canada-China relations at Brock University and a former diplomat to China. We've reached him today in St. Catharines, Ontario. Welcome to the show, sir. Let's begin this morning because I think a lot of people will wake up being slightly confused. I thought these two men were already arrested. I thought they were already facing the charges. Talk to us about the significance and the timing of the official arrest taking place now.
Well, previously, Mr. Kovrig and Mr. Spavor had been detained by the Chinese Ministry of State Security, where they were subject to very harsh interrogation and sensory deprivation, and they hadn't seen sunlight since they were taken away, with no established charge. Now they have been transferred to a regular prison where they'll be in cells with many other Chinese men, all of whom will be serious criminals. And
we're normal for time.
I think that what we're looking at here is a development in the case, in the sense that they should be able to eventually get access to legal representation. There should be an opportunity for us to know where they are and visit them, and their families may be able to see them. So on the whole, I think this is a positive development and could be preparatory to their being released.
I understand it's a busy morning for you, sir. There's also the issue, because you're describing this as a positive possible step forward for the two Canadian men. But in the New York Times, they're stating that this actually makes it much more likely that the two Canadians will face trial and conviction. And it, in fact, deepens the standoff between the two men, the two countries, I should say. So how then is that to be interpreted as a positive step?
Well, I think when they were in the black jail, we really had no possibility of engaging on what was happening with them. It was a security matter, and when they were met with the consular officials, they were not allowed to discuss their case as such. So now we're looking at a situation where the Chinese are opening this up to the possibility of us providing evidence that the charges against them are utterly false and that they're not guilty of anything. And I think in general, the change in Canada-China relations could be based on the fact that, the Conservative leader has articulated a China policy that would be very hostile to China's interests in Canada if there's a change of government. And it strikes me that it's likely the Chinese government are rethinking their overall approach here, because what they've been doing so far is getting them any closer to their goal of seeing Ms. Meng Wanzhou released from her house arrest in Vancouver.
So do you think, in fact, the two men are going to go to trial?
It's hard to say. That would be a long time off, and they could be held for a very protracted period in the prison before it comes up for trial. I mean, literally years. But I hope it doesn't come to trial, because if it does come to trial, chances are they'll be convicted. And in the case of these espionage charges, the punishment would typically be a death penalty. So we definitely don't want to see it moving in that direction.
I was asking you earlier about the timing, because our Foreign Affairs Minister, Chrystia Freeland, was in Washington yesterday talking about the tensions between China, the United States, and between China and Canada. How much of that is playing out between these two men?
Well, I think certainly Canada feels that the United States should be more proactive in defending our interests in the trade with the banning of the canola and the pork and the other agricultural commodities that are being slowed in customs inspection. But, the United States also has consular cases with China that they haven't been able to resolve. So it's hard to say to what extent they can assist us in this matter. I think that it's also unlikely that the United States can, at least the executive of the United States, can stop the process of the fraud charges against Meng Wanzhou, because those, again, are in the hands of U.S. judicial authorities in New York State, and therefore the charges are going to go through. The extradition hearing process will go through. Our government will not be able to interfere in that one. So I think in general we're looking at a situation that goes on and on.
Okay, so if the Americans can't step in, what can the Canadians do at this point?
Well, I think we should be more proactive in pursuing our interests in terms of, perhaps expelling some of the agents of the Chinese Ministry of State Security operating in Canada, slowing China's shipments into Canada as they're doing with us, in our case on the basis of fentanyl. We know that there's a lot of fentanyl in the Chinese shipments that the Chinese government has not been prepared to slow. And we ought to get an ambassador in Beijing. And if China is refusing to accept our candidates for ambassador, then I think our only action would be to expel the Chinese ambassador in retaliation.
Okay, sir, we will leave it there. Thank you so much for your time.
Take care.